Okay, so we've learned 4 inference forms. Now it's time to apply them to assess arguments for validity or invalidity. Let's take a look at this argument first. If the cat isn't in the room, then Pat won't sneeze. Pat is sneezing, therefore the cat is in the room. Now, the first thing we're going to do is focus in on the if-then sentence. It might not be always the first sentence in the argument. That's okay. Even if the sentences are written in another order, Pat is sneezing. If the cat isn't in the room, then Pat won't sneeze, for instance. We will look at the if-then sentence first. That's really important because that will tell us what the front part is and what the back part is. So, if the cat isn't in the room, the front part is the cat isn't in the room. Then Pat won't sneeze. The back part is Pat won't sneeze. So we have here our if-then sentence, if front, then back. And we know for sure what the front part is and what the back part is. Now we're going to take a look at the next claim. Pat is sneezing. And ask yourself, is that more like the front or more like the back? Well, it's more like the back, right? Because the back part is what talks about Pat and sneezing. Is it exactly the back or is it the opposite of the back? And here you might see the wisdom of talking about the opposite of the back rather than not the back. Because the back part is Pat won't sneeze, this is Pat is sneezing. That's the opposite of Pat won't sneeze. So it's actually the opposite of the back. Now we can turn to the conclusion. Therefore, the cat is in the room. Well, is that more like the front or more like the back? It's more like the front. Is it exactly the front or is it the opposite of the front? It is the opposite of the front, right? Because the front says the cat isn't in the room, and this says the cat is in the room. So it's the opposite of the front. Now, once you get really comfortable with these inference forms, you will look at that and you will know right away that's valid. And so the argument, the inference in the original argument is valid too. But if you're not there yet, and I frankly would be amazed if you were, poodle dog it. But here is a really important point. What you poodle dog is the abstract representation of the argument in terms of fronts and backs. Don't poodle dog the argument in English, because if you do, what you might very well do is think something like this. Okay, if Max isn't a poodle, then Max isn't a dog, right? But that's the wrong if-then. The if-then you always want to have in your mind is if Max is a poodle, then Max is a dog, because that's the if-then that's true, and that's the if-then that will prime all the right intuitions. If you apply the poodle dog to the English argument itself, it may end in tears. Always apply poodle dog to the abstract representation in terms of fronts and backs, if you can't remember whether that form is valid or not. So let's do it. If Max is a poodle, then Max is a dog. Max is not a dog. Can Max possibly be a poodle? I don't see how. That's valid. Right? If Max is a dog, if Max is a poodle, then Max is a dog. Right? If Max is a poodle, then Max is a dog. Max is not a dog. Max can't be a poodle. Valid. Super. Let's do the next one. By the way, I'm going to be using the same if-then through all of these. So it's going to be identical. If the cat isn't in the room, that's the front part, then Pat won't sneeze. That's the back part. Now, I'd like you to work a little bit on your own. So what I want you to think about is the next sentence. Is that the front, the back, the opposite of the front, or the opposite of the back? Write that down. And then the conclusion. Is that the front, the back, the opposite of the front, or the opposite of the back? And write that down. So once you've done that, come back. But for now, Pause the video. Okay. The cat isn't in the room. Is that more like the front or more like the back? Well, it's more like the front. Is it the front or is it the opposite of the front? Well, the front is the cat isn't in the room. That's exactly what this is saying. So it's the same thing. It's the same thing as the front. Therefore, Pat won't sneeze. Is that the front, the back, the opposite of the front, or the opposite of the back? Well, it seems like it's more like the back part, right? Is it exactly that or the opposite? Well, the back part says Pat won't sneeze, and so does this. So it looks like exactly the back part. There's the form. Now, if you are really comfortable with these forms, you will know right away if it's valid or invalid. But if you're not, poodle dog it. And remember, what are you poodle dogging? Are you poodle dogging the English argument? Oh, no, no, no. You are poodle dogging the abstract representation in terms of fronts and backs. So think for a bit, decide if this is valid or invalid, pause the video, and come back when you've decided. What do you think? If Max is a poodle and Max is a dog, Max is a poodle, looks like Max is a dog. Very good. One more. If the cat isn't in the room, front part, then Pat won't sneeze, back part. If front, then back. So now what I would like you to do is identify the next claim. Is it the front, the back, opposite of the front, opposite of the back? And then same for the conclusion. Is it the front, the back, opposite of the front, opposite of the back? And then decide if it's valid or invalid. So do it all, okay? Pause the video and come back when you're ready. Okay, so what do you have? Pat isn't sneezing. Is that more like the front or more like the back? Well, it looks like it's more like the back. Is it exactly the back or the opposite? I think it's exactly the back, right? Pat won't sneeze. Pat isn't sneezing except for the grammatical adjustment. It's the same thing. Therefore, the cat isn't in the room. Is that more like the front, more like the back, more like the front? Is it exactly the front or the opposite of the front? It's exactly the front. That would be what? Well, let's poodle dog it. If Max is a poodle, then Max is a dog. Okay. Max is a dog. Okay. Can you conclude that Max is a poodle? It's invalid. Right? We're going to come back to that one because it might seem counterintuitive that it's invalid, but in fact it is. For now, though, let's take a look at the last one. Do this from top to bottom on your own. Identify the front, identify the back, figure out what the next claim is in terms of fronts and backs, figure out what the conclusion is in terms of fronts and backs, and then decide whether that inference is valid or invalid. Pause the video, come back when you're ready. Okay. If the cat isn't in the room, front part, then Pat won't sneeze, back part. So that is if front, then back. The cat is in the room. Well, that looks like it's more related to the front part than it is to the back part. But it's not exactly the front part, it's the opposite of the front part, right? Because the front part says the cat isn't in the room, and this says the cat is in the room. So opposite of the front. And the conclusion, Pat will sneeze. Well, that would be more like the back part, right? But it's not exactly the back part because the back part says Pat won't sneeze, and this is saying Pat will sneeze, so it's the opposite of the back part. Super duper. Now, is that valid or invalid? Let's poodle dog it. If Max is a poodle, then Max is a dog. Max isn't a poodle. Do you know that Max isn't a dog? No, because Max could be a schnauzer. Invalid. Good. Now, I want to talk about these last two that are invalid because you might be thinking, this is wrong. This is giving us the wrong answer because if the cat isn't in the room, then Pat won't sneeze. Pat isn't sneezing. It has to follow that the cat isn't in the room, right? Well, no, let's figure out why not by relying upon why this is invalid and doesn't work for poodles and dogs. Then we'll be able to see that it isn't valid for exactly the same reason. So if Max is a poodle, then Max is a dog. Max is a dog. Can we conclude that Max is a poodle? No, because there are other ways to end up being a dog than being a poodle. There are other ways for the back part to happen than the front part happening, right? There are more roads to doghood than poodleness. So let's translate that insight to this argument. This is saying that if the cat isn't in the room, then Pat won't sneeze. But there might be more roads for Pat not sneezing than the cat not being in the room. Maybe there are other reasons why Pat won't sneeze, just like maybe there are other ways to be a dog. I can think of some. Maybe Pat took allergy medication. Maybe Pat is wearing some kind of a face mask so that he won't inhale the dander or whatever it is that makes people sneeze when they're allergic to cats, right? That's why that's invalid. But that's a hard insight to have, I think. If I'm reading this argument and I'm not thinking about it in terms of inference forms, I might very well think that that inference is valid. The Bob method could deceive me. It's invalid, in fact. Same thing here. If I'm looking at this English argument, I might say, okay, if the cat isn't in the room, then Pat won't sneeze. But the cat is in the room, so Pat has to sneeze, right? No, same thinking. One reason that Pat might not sneeze is the cat not being in the room. But that's not necessarily the only way that Pat might end up not sneezing. Pat might take some allergy medication. Pat might be wearing his face mask, lots of things. So that's exactly why inference forms are useful. They can help us to avoid making mistakes like that, and they can make it unnecessary for us to think very hard once we have the inference forms memorized. But it's really important to have them memorized. So in the next video, I want to do a little bit of drill with you. So we'll pick it up there. See you later.